Well, hello and welcome to the webinar today, the first in our series of webinars looking at dementia practice. And hope you can hear me. I'll just check that I've got an unmute thing there. Okay. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathered and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and our shared futures, and in particular the people of the Wurundjeri Nation and the Kulin people, which the land on which I'm seated here today, and I know we're all in different parts of the country as part of today's webinar. So we're excited to have, I think we've had over 1,800 people register for today's event, which is a fantastic response to this area, and I think reflects the level of interest in today's conversation, which is really an opportunity for us to get I guess a sense from some very experienced senior executives from across the aged care sector as to, I was saying before to the panel, almost getting a bit of a pulse sense as to how things have gone post-Royal Commission, and certainly into the last 2 challenging years that COVID has brought, obviously, to the aged care sector, not to mention our communities more broadly. So I think this is an important opportunity to really have that discussion. And in particular, we're really interested in focusing on the areas that our panel members are most proud of in what they've been able to achieve in providing care and support to people living with dementia through these challenging times. The second aspect of our discussion today will be around what has been most challenging as part of providing that care and support, and any key learnings that have come from that piece, which I think we'll be interested to hear on and reflect on. And I'd imagine there's a wealth of experience online as well, and you can gauge how that aligns with your own experience in aged care and having come through the same period of time that we've been faced with and challenged by. The final point is really an opportunity for our panel to reflect on an area, and I've indicated already to them that I'll push them on this, what's one thing that can make the biggest difference to improving the quality of care in this country. And that's acknowledging that there is obviously a much broader change agenda already underway as a result of the government's response to the Royal Commission, and there are a whole range of initiatives that are being progressed by government, by the sector, the Industry Workforce Council, the Commission for Quality and Safety, and the work that the regulator is doing in this space. So there's a whole broader agenda of pieces here, but we are really keen today to very much focus on what's happening on the ground with providers out there at the moment. And now all of that will be certainly an opportunity for you to engage, and we are keen to hear your comments, views, feedback, questions throughout today's discussion. So an important part of that is we do have one of our facilitators, and I'll introduce her in a minute to you, who will be moderating those questions so that we can make sure that we're really trying to package those up so that we can get the best possible coverage of the questions and comments that you're raising throughout today's webinar. So the other key thing to say by way of introduction today is you will, from a technology viewpoint, only see one panel member or one person speaking at any one time. Doesn't mean we've all left the room. We're all still virtually here, but it just for the purposes of the technology, it means that we're able to just focus it in that way. So don't feel that, oh, the panel member I was going to speak to is gone. No, they haven't. They're here. So just want to reassure you from that point of view. In terms of if you do have questions or comments, we do encourage you to enter those into the Q&A section. And we have both Amanda and Claire from our team who will be actually monitoring this. So if you see them in there responding and you're getting responses from Amanda or Claire, that is actually coming from Dementia Australia. So just flagging that for you. If a question requires just a direct response, they might be able to assist you with that. Otherwise, we'll look at making sure they're obviously shared with the wider audience. So we've got the collective think tank or the collective wisdom online I'm sure many of you will be able to answer other people's questions and comments as well. So I'd invite you to do that as part of this. I think we're all familiar with social media and that wonderful thing of the thumbs up and the like. The benefit we've got with the way we've set up today's proceedings is that if you do like a question or a comment, it actually ranks it for us. So we'll push it up the more votes it gets virtually. I'm starting to sound like a reality TV show now. But yeah, it will push it up in a ranking. That will actually help us. So really encourage you to use that function as well. If there's particular questions that you think, oh yeah, I was going to ask that, or yeah, really good point. And that will just help us make sure we get to the questions that are of most interest to you all. With that, I will now go to introducing our panel. Ahead of today, we've shared the bios of all of our panel members. So I'm actually not going to read any bios as part of this because I really want to maximise the time we've got for the conversation and the discussion. But I'm sure you'll all agree that having seen their bios, that they have really a wealth of experience in a whole range of contexts that they bring to today's conversation. And I do want to start by thanking them all for being very generous with giving up their time today with all of the continued demands on their time. To be able to give that to us is a really great offering for us and the sector and people living with dementia more broadly. So thank you for that. So to go through our panel, so we have Megan Dalton, who's the CEO of Noosa Care. We have Jason Erling, who's the CEO of Southern Cross Care in Queensland. Melissa McDonald, who's Executive General Manager of Clinical and Care Practice at Regis Aged Care. Peter Williams, CEO of One Care. And Carmel Costas, who's a facilitator at the Centre for Dementia Learning, who will be moderating your questions for the panel. So I welcome all of our panel members and we'll jump straight into my first question to the panel. So coming back to my opening comments, my first question to you is what's something you're most proud of in your work supporting people living with dementia? And I'll start with asking that to you, Megan.
Thank you. Hi, everybody, and thank you for having me today. What we're most proud of in our delivering services and care to our residents living with dementia is our model. So we have more focus on the external environmental areas. So we have a number of different themed gardens. We have created similar themed areas to what residents would experience living out in their community. So the Noosa community, we have the rainforest, the river. We actually do have a running river. We have our rural shed for those who've come from the country in the hinterland, and we also have our beach theme in our new area where we provide another 32 residents living with dementia. We have an actual fire pit area. We have beautiful gardens externally with landscape architect design. We worked with Dementia Australia actually for our building design as well as our external pathways.
Thanks very much, Megan. And wow, that sounds like that you've done a lot in that built environment space. And obviously we know that's such an important consideration in creating the right care environment for people with dementia. And fantastic, that reflects very much of the local environment as well. I might go to Jason now.
Hi, David. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity. So what are we most proud about? It's really, with our organisations, about people. It always starts with people first. So really proud about the organisation's leadership and culture. I think we should always be mindful of the frontline staff who do the bulk of the work. I think that's and the challenges of you mentioned COVID, David, and you mentioned the Royal Commission, and their resilience, but their continued love of residents and clients within our communities, I think, is just really so uplifting. So we take real gratitude in that. I think also what we're also really proud of is making dementia core for our business. So we've as an organisation setting a clear vision. So our vision talks simply about growing communities where best lives are lived, and that means everybody's life. And so I think having a clear vision, mission, values, and strategy is really key as well. And then really at the heart of all that's our culture. So that's probably what we're most proud of. But our people are everything in our organisation. So we can talk about built environments. We understand things are never perfect. We actually try to love what we've got and to make the best with what we've got. So I think that's that's the old saying. It takes a village to raise a child, and we sort of take that approach in our philosophy of looking after our communities and those suffering with dementia. So I could probably talk to you all day, and those who know me, I get very passionate about this space. But leadership and culture is really at the heart of it. And I think also collective wisdom of learning together and sharing. I think there's the experts on this panel today, the good work that Dementia Australia is doing. I think we do a lot of great work, and we should celebrate that. I think that you mentioned that, David, at the start of your intro, is to give thanks to the great work. It's never as bad as we think it is. And we should be really thankful for what we've got.
Thanks, Jason. And look, really good points there, I think, around that leadership and culture piece. I know through our own work at the centre, that's where we see the key change, I think, or shift or improvement in practice, is where you've got really strong leadership, and that sets a culture, that particularly a learning culture, where staff can have the reassurance to know that they can make mistakes, and that there's not going to be something that unfortunate that happens as a result of that, because that's how we learn. And certainly in the context of dementia care, no one thing's necessarily going to work from day to day, and you've got to be ready to try things that might not work today, that worked yesterday, and will work differently tomorrow. So I think that's a couple of really great points you've raised there, Jason. Melissa.
Wonderful, thank you. Thanks very much, David, and hello to everyone on the webinar. It's great to see those numbers are so large. So I think with us at Regis, I think one of the thing that we're most proud of, and certainly I'm most proud of, is really the sort of the recent shift. When I say recent, I mean sort of over the last sort of 2 years to 18 months of the consumer partnership models, and how we're really sort of making that sort of fundamental to everything that we are doing, and ensuring that the human rights approach and sort of that person-centred care is truly driving and is truly fundamental to all that we do. And the consumer is a partner, and the consumer obviously is our resident, and certainly our residents and residents' families and carers, and particularly those with dementia who have their own particular requirements, their own particular needs. They are specific to themselves, to their lives and to their stories, and become fundamental in the care that they require, that actually helps them live a better life where they are, and certainly with us at Regis, and I know that our other providers are thinking the same thing. So really focusing our activities, our governance models around consumer partnership models is very important to us. We have actually sort of embedded that into all of our sort of governance, our committees. We start our committees with a consumer story, and obviously the dementia story plays a very large part in that, given the percentage of the residents that we have throughout our homes that do have dementia. We also make sure that those of us at all levels that are providing care and sort of establishing sort of strategic directions and relationships with those who provide care understand the nuance and the spectrum of what dementia might mean. We have ensured that our executive team have all undertaken the enabling EDI experience. We have, and that was when we were fortunate enough to be together enough to do that, and it was actually quite a disturbing experience for some who had never actually had that experience, had never actually sort of had insight into that, and for others who actually have family members who were impacted as well. So it was a really important piece of understanding, you know, what is effectively sort of our core business. We've also made sure that our building and development team have undertaken that as well, so that they truly understand the experience themselves. So when they're thinking about their build, and that's one of the things we need to be mindful of, we know that there is particular interest in the build in the small household, and when we're working with our developers and our architects and our planners, they are fundamental in creating these environments. So really sort of bringing them in to have that experience and bringing them in to understand the consumer experience and really developing that sort of consumer partnership, understanding, acknowledge and respect is really fundamental to what we are doing, and sort of embedded in all of our activities and our planning models at the moment. So I think that's really, that sort of partnership model is probably something at the moment that we're really most proud of and really working to embed, and just make sure that that sort of that becomes inherent in everything that we do. Thank you. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Melissa. And I think that's a really good point you make about the, you know, how you do that piece in partnership. Actually, I was talking to a CEO just this week, and they were saying what a difference it's made to actually have at all their board meetings have a consumer talk to the board, and how grounding that is for the work of the board to go, oh, okay, there's a direct recipient of what we're doing, and how we can make sure that our service is actually responding to their needs. So I think certainly that giving those insights to your building team, your exec team, that's I think a really positive piece, and grounded in a human rights perspective, I think is also something that I think we're seeing a growing recognition of the need to see very much that human rights element to aging, aged care as being really critical. So some further really great points there in terms of your approach to that. Peter.
Thank you very much, David. I mean, I certainly agree with what the other panelists have talked about already. I think from my perspective as the CEO for One Care Limited here in Tasmania, we're working on that true integrated and inclusive model of service, model of care. Across our 5 homes, only 2 of those have dedicated memory support units. And of course, we have many other residents living with dementia in our other homes as well. And being a clinical CEO, being on the front line, talking with staff, listening to the staff and responding has been so powerful for us in these very challenging times, given the commission and given COVID. And I guess just as an example of that, last year we've added an additional 30,000 hours in one home alone, and a further 15,000 clinical hours this year to ensure 7-day-a-week services, to ensure that those personal care needs of our consumers are really well supported and met. And at the same time, I think it really adds value to our staff, who also feel supported. You know, when you listen to their stories and their challenges, I think that's an incredibly important role as an organisational leader, is to be responsive and be compassionate. Things that Jason spoke about in that leadership field, it's so important to me as well. And I think just lastly to say, you know, I think supporting staff with competence is something else I'm very proud of, in creating educational pathways and scholarship funds for our staff to continue their learning. That's another factor that One Care's done in order to really ensure that those living with dementia are well supported by well qualified staff who, you know, love what they do, and I'm really proud of that.
Thanks, Peter. And I think Jason and I were talking about that earlier this week in terms of that that importance with all the challenges around staff attraction and retention in the sector, all for reasons I think we're probably acutely aware of. But then the importance of how you try and retain staff, and you're investing in staff. And so your comment about scholarships and providing those learning opportunities is really important. I think I said in a fairly, I often get asked this, but you know, why should I invest in my staff? Because they might leave. And I said, well, if you don't invest in them, they may leave. So, you know, I think there is some really important opportunities there that I think a lot of good providers are absolutely doing what you're doing there, and we would lend our voice to that in terms of where we see really great practice out there is where there is that investment in staff to ensure that they have the right level of knowledge and skill, but that knowledge and skill is importantly informed by empathy. And I think that's the point that Melissa raised earlier, that you really need to have that sense and get some insight into what it might be like to live with dementia. And obviously that's been a focus of our work, that enables people to go, oh, okay, so what is the attitude I bring to work, and then what's the behaviours that necessarily follow that. So I think that's that really where we see the shift, and where you have people on the ground that are those dementia practice leaders that can mentor and coach your direct care staff in how they actually support people living with dementia. So that's really, really great to hear. I might just pause for a minute and just check in with Carmel to see if we've got questions or comments through the chat.
Thank you, David. Yes, the chat is very busy, so thank you to those that are contributing in some really interesting comments and quite a few common threads as well. David, a question around the environment, or it was originally a comment. The environment is overlooked, and I know Melissa and Megan touched on the environment, so I'm wondering about that as a potential question or comment. Another one around the lack of suitable accommodation for younger onset dementia. That's probably the most popular comment at the moment. So that seems to be of great concern. Some other questions around staff training. That's always popular, and I know Peter spoke to that a short while ago, as did other panel members. So specifically, what type of dementia training? So there are a few themes for the moment.
Thanks, Carmel. I might take that last one first, and we'll work back through the odd and then the design one. I might actually go to you, Peter, on that that training, development, capacity building piece. You able to say a bit more about what you mentioned, more about how you're going about that investment in your staff in that regard?
Yeah, look, it certainly is a really good point, and I think it would be fair to say that there is so much available education training out there. If you look for it, and certainly in Tasmania, the University of Tasmania has a very strong focus in dementia. So locally for us, there are opportunities, but also broadly, there are many other well-known education programs and training that is available. So from our perspective, we've taken a broad view and tried to get consistency. I think is fundamental to say. Being consistent with what you're trying to do in terms of training education for your staff is probably a point for your leadership team to be really focused on, because, as I said, look, you could scattergun and do all sorts of training, but is it really supporting your strategic piece? And I think that's fundamental. So for us, I want to come back to the fact I want our staff to be competent in dementia support. And so in saying that, making sure as a minimum standard our staff are trained in that basic provisions of dementia. Obviously care staff are incredibly important, but our registered staff as well. And I think looking at those postgraduate qualifications, that's where our scholarship programs are really sort of tailored into, is postgraduate specialist certificates, if you like. So that's another element of training that we do. But I think, just to touch back on what's available through Dementia Australia, I mean, there's a lot of resources there, and we have relied heavily in that space. So, look, I hope that provides a little bit of clarity for the question that was asked.
Thanks, Peter. Look, that's great, and I absolutely support your comment about consistency so that everyone is absolutely on the same page. I do also want to acknowledge that Dementia Australia is part of Dementia Training Australia, so there are a wealth of online, freely available, fully funded resources on their website as well. So we're proud to be part of Dementia Training Australia in what they offer. I might just see if there's anyone else on the panel who would like to make a comment on that. Perhaps if you can put your hand up, and that means I won't put you on the spot. Looks like, Melissa, have you got something you wanted to add to that?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, David. I was just sort of in keeping with that theme. One of the things that we are doing and have actually engaged Dementia Australia with is to ensure consistency of language and ensure consistency of approach and response is quite critical, because one of the risks is that there are many and varied sort of training opportunities out there, and what we really need to do, or what we have committed to do, is to ensure that we the model of care and the language that's used is consistent. And we have actually acquired, and it will be an all of organisation approach. All of our staff are our care team effectively, and they'll be undertaking the what is dementia and a problem-solving approach to behaviours. So as a minimum and as sort of a foundation that actually informs everybody who works with us of what it is, sort of our approach is, our response is, and, thinking about, sort of the understanding behaviours and how best to provide care in that environment. So, but I think that the point is well made around the consistency. So starting with that as the foundation and providing work and access to funding through various scholarships. We have a scholarship program as well, and really promoting that post-grad and really encouraging and making sure that we ourselves, it is within our remit to ensure that those career paths that currently aren't there, that we actually help create those career paths and help provide opportunities for our staff to access through various means. And the other thing I think that's critical in terms of sort of education and training is to sort of participate in institutes and possibly peak bodies, and I'm thinking specifically around the Australian College of Nursing and their Faculty of Ageing, and the learning and the opportunity not just to learn but actually be a part of the reform and the change that's needed. So it actually sort of pays off to be part of the education, to be providing the education to your staff, and therefore contribute to what is sort of necessary in terms of where our wonderful sort of sector and the care for our residents and our clients is going.
Thanks, Melissa. Some really great points there. And yes, look, I think that whole learning pathway piece and career pathway is important. I think we're probably further away from the career pathway than we are the learning one. But certainly, and I know we're doing some work as well in that space to really enable people from that direct care workforce level to undertake further qualifications at a Certificate 4 level, and working closely with our colleagues at UTAS to see how that can actually segue into their suite of courses as well, so that we are really recognising that there is a specialist skill set that is required around dementia, but there's also an overarching level of knowledge that's required across the workforce as well. So some really good points there, and I know that obviously a lot of that was picked up through the Royal Commission work as well, as we know, when they highlighted the need for minimum levels of education around dementia and palliative care. I might change focus a bit and pick up the question that was raised around design. And I might come to you, Megan, on that one, because it sounded like you were doing some really exciting pieces in your area around the built environment and really trying to make it a really positive experience for the people you're caring for.
Yeah, thanks, David. So on our Carramar site in Tewantin, we originally, on our main site, we have 14 villas of 8 beds. And when we decided to move our dementia 2 small villas into a larger site, vacant land, we built a 32-bed H design, I suppose you could say, with the back of house in the middle and on either side 16 beds. But the main focus for us in our dementia model was going to be the external environment. So we don't have what I call the V8 pathways. Our grounds are quite large for our residents living with dementia to actually manoeuvre freely and independently from the internal environment to the external. Every door has access externally and it leads back to internally. We are a secured environment in this particular area. However, the fencing, it was really important that you did not see the fencing. So we have, our gardens are extensive. They hide the fence line, so you actually don't feel like you're in a secured environment. So the pathways, as I said, lead out into the garden areas, and I touched on the themes of those original building. So many of our residents are from our local community, so they've grown up and raised their families, lived and worked within the Noosa Shire and the hinterland. And it was really important that when they had to make that really challenging decision to move into aged care, that it was like a seamless transition from the local community into our dementia living community. We call it our dementia living community. And it was important for us that residents actually continue to live the life that they choose. So apart from our external environment, we don't have work routines. The residents' routine is the routine for the staff. So every day, like your family and my family, that changes. So if I was to be a resident, woke up at 12 o'clock at night, it's not for the staff to say, come on, get back into bed. If I want to go out for a walk around the pathways in the gardens, because I did that when I lived out in the community, then that's what their routine is. We had a wait list. We're always full. So we chose to expand on our original 32 beds, and this time, due to council regulations, we actually had to consider 2-storey, and we don't have that on our site. So we went to 4 by 8 bed villas, 2 different designs. We worked with, we had Dementia Australia involved to make sure that we were accommodating for the residents' environment, so they could freely see key signs. They knew how to move in and out of the building. The trick and the challenge was to have a lift. We were very determined to have a lift that opened when a resident arrives. The sequence is that a resident walks in and it automatically tells verbally the resident that they're going to close the door, and then it's going down to the next floor and then out into the external gardens. It was really important that residents still had that independent decision making. So we have another 32 beds, and at the moment we're full with 64 beds. But what part of our design that we chose to include in this was to have an entry building into the actual community. So any family and residents walk freely in and out their own entry building. They don't have to come to the main site. They have their own cafe, they have their own community centre. However, our residents still can participate externally on the main site and walk up to all of the other activities, but we have provided that for them to use internally. So families have got a swipe to come in and out, and they freely come and go, and that's at their loved one's routine, not our routine. So there's extensive pathways outside of the actual environment leading down to the community centre and the entry building. So it was really about duplicating what I would say, what you would find out in our community around the Noosa Shire and the hinterland. I hope that's given a bit of insight into our design.
Yeah, look, that's so much thought and consideration obviously has gone into the planning of that, which is really great, and obviously involving people living with dementia and their families and carers in what they saw that they needed. So yeah. I think that's really excellent.
I suppose my key saying is, don't be afraid, be creative. There's no boundaries of what you can create for people living with dementia. And I think that's the exciting part. Yes, you can have your aged care furniture as well, but I went outside of that and bought locally from the shops that they shopped at. I've had designed garden landscape designs that you would find in a lot of the buildings around homes around the Noosa Shire and the hinterlands. So that was really important that we include that as well.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Megan. And look, we did have one final question around younger onset dementia, and I'll just ask any of the panel if you'd like to make any comment on any aspect of your service that particularly targets that group, because I'm not familiar with it, whether any of you do any work in that space in particular. I'm just doing a quick scan around. No. Look, I do know that there are some services, I think Mercy Health in Victoria, certainly out in Montrose, they put a lot of work in, and we contributed to a lot of their planning around younger onset as part of what they do there. So I know there are services out there that have had a specific focus on how best to address the needs of that group, which is always a particularly vexed one. Obviously, you want to make sure aged care is as appropriate as it can be for older people, and I think the points that Megan, you were making before, go to that. But equally, there are challenges there around that younger cohort, which we know, and obviously straddling the disability system and the aged care system is one of the challenges we constantly face in the work that we do in supporting them to get the care and support that they need. Which is improving, I have to say, but certainly still much to be done in that space. So we probably haven't answered that question that I know you flagged for us, Carmel, but certainly an area I know that absolutely more needs to be done in that context. All right, conscious of time, so we might move on then to the second question, which is really what has been the greatest challenge that you feel your organisation has faced in providing dementia care in recent times. I'm sure there's plenty of COVID examples in there, but don't feel you've got to be limited to that. But I might start this conversation with you, Jason.
Thanks, David, and what a great conversation. So COVID has been one, definitely, and I think when we think about COVID in some of the rural and remote settings has been typically difficult, and I think that also leans back to the design. So I think we have legacy within this industry of not having the benefit of what Megan has today, having buildings were built maybe at Regis 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. And I think there's a challenge there. So I think that's something we should be really mindful about. How do we create best practice inside those environments, I think is one of the things I think we should consider. So that's a challenge, I think, to current design or past design and its impact on today's future, I think is really tricky. And I think, with an industry that's typically undercapitalized, I don't want to talk about finance, but if you think that the industry is struggling, and then how do you create innovation and opportunity for investment to really grow these communities where best lives can be lived, I think is really tricky. Doesn't matter if you're not for profit, private, listed entity, it doesn't matter. Everybody's doing great work, but we're all in that same bucket. So I think there's some challenges there. So the built environment, I think one of the other challenges I see, especially in our organisation and having a close ear to our people, is they are tired. I think there's that fatigue word. I think Peter maybe spoke about that. You've got a workforce that's really under challenge. It's hard. I'm sure anybody who sits there and looks at rosters on a daily basis, or you're trying to fill, and there's a lot of practical stuff that happens there, and then you're trying to get training on top. So it's this beautiful. There's a real, almost paradoxical, isn't it? In some ways, that it's sort of you're trying to build and create. So I think there's some real challenge there, but as at the start, again, as I prefaced at the very, very start, we'll always do the best with what we've got. And I think I love what Megan said too. I think curious innovation. Peter used the word, I think I put down confidence to learn and be curious about learning, and having a culture that allows for questions and love, and to create that home environment so important. So look, there's challenges, but on the flip side, I wrote down, instead of challenge, I think it's change. I don't know if the word challenge is right. I think we're in constant change. I think impermanence is real, and I think it's such a lovely thing if you accept it. But if you keep bumping into it, there's obviously going to be some heartache along the way. But challenge and change, I think, go hand in hand. I think our industry, I've never seen it like this over the last probably 2 years, maybe even 3-5 years. It's really struggled, and I think the capital side is really to invest back into what needs to happen to create these amazing communities. I think it's a real challenge. I hope, hope's not a strategy, but I do pray and hope that there is some real changes for this industry, especially around sustainability, because without us being sustainable, we're all going to be in trouble, and we're going to keep trying to do the best we can, which I think what everybody's doing now, but it doesn't allow for innovation, because when you're in that sort of fight and flight mode, it's typically not something where innovation is allowed to come forward. So I've probably asked you a few questions there, David, but that's I think, you know, we've got an industry that's been going since 1957. I think it goes back as far as that. That's when it sort of commenced. And you think about all the things we've got to today, I think we do have a lot of legacy, and then the ability to reinvest.
Thanks, Jason. Wow, you covered a fair bit of territory there. And look, just in reflecting on what you're saying about capital, I was hearing earlier this week from, I think it was a gentleman from Grant Thornton, the consultancy firm there, that talked about 3 things that really impact on aged care currently. One is the labour market, one is the consumer market, and the third one is the capital market. And just going to your point about capital, it's a really difficult environment with what's happening, obviously, with the reform agenda, with all things question mark over RADs, that makes it a difficult environment for people to see confidently and competently to invest in. So there is, I think, a level of reticence at the moment to see aged care as a potential place to invest capital in, and the extent to which the comment that was made in this presentation was the extent to which government appreciate the importance of that is probably potentially lacking in what they looked at in terms of the whole reform agenda. So yeah, but look, you know, certainly talking about the impact on your staff and the extent to which people feel tired and fatigued through all of what they've been through, when you consider the demands of the work, even without that little thing called COVID, has, I know, put huge challenges on the sector. Melissa, your reflections on that piece.
I think, Jason, you've effectively said everything that I was going to, but certainly one of the biggest challenges for us is that the built form and, you know, sort of the design. And obviously, you know, Regis has a large number of homes across Australia, many of which we've acquired over a number of years, and we have many legacy homes that are quite old and obviously sort of in need of redeveloping, which is part of our agenda. Capital pending, David. But you know, the just sort of working in, you know, sort of the freedom from restraint and acknowledging, you know, sort of freedom of movement and just, you know, sort of the small household sort of living for our residents, and certainly those with dementia, when you've actually got an environment that was effectively based on a medical model and a long Nightingale wing. It's a really hard environment to work with, and we are working through how we repurpose and redesign some of those spaces. So certainly one of the biggest challenges is, as we're sort of waiting, you know, for our redevelopment and sort of build, which will take some time, obviously, given the number that we have, but just working with what we have and how we best sort of refashion and repurpose those so that they are sort of fit for purpose. I think one of the other challenges that faces us all is the rhetoric, is the vitriol, and that really needs to sort of stop. And we need to, you know, it's part of our remit to sort of, as part of that reform agenda, is to sort of change the narrative and change the perception of our sector, the care that we provide, to our residents, dementia residents and others, but certainly starting to have some influence in how the sector is perceived. Because unless that changes, and unless we sort of help change the narrative, the workforce issues will continue to perpetuate. Not only will we have trouble recruiting and drawing new staff in the absence of career pathways, as we've already said, but we will just as a base sort of, you know, staff, just drawing them into a sector. There is not a lot there at the moment, considering the vitriol, demonisation and that sort of ongoing rhetoric, and certainly we're seeing that played out in the political, you know, sort of divide at the moment with the election pending. But I'll stop that there. But I think that's one of the other bigger challenges for us as well is you know, the perception of the sector, the perception of, you know, sort of the work that gets done in the sector, and how we sort of counter that, and how we actually say, yes, we are a sector in reform, and, you know, we need much needed, and we're really excited about that, and we want you to come with us. We want you to be a part of that reform. So just thinking about, you know, sort of that as a challenge, I think is quite pervasive, and obviously it sort of kicked off with COVID when that started, and that was really hard to handle when we had the staff who were working relentlessly in our environments and supporting our residents and sort of reading about themselves in the paper, and it's sort of shifted very much from that, but it's really sort of, you know, continuing to bubble along. So definitely one of our biggest challenges. I mean, obviously I think, you know, we've talked about, you know, sort of remuneration as well, but I think and the transparency around the funding model is critical to give certainty to what we can expect. That's probably creating some uncertainty as well. And I think just societal sort of, you know, change and expectation, and sort of family expectation and GPs, and collectively as a society, how do, you know, the challenge is sort of how do we change that narrative so that we can have these conversations, we can influence care and greater outcomes. So but, you know, it's there are challenges, but they're actually there. That's what actually keeps us engaged, and actually does, you know, sort of help us to sort of look for research opportunities, innovation, and sort of ways of coming up with the solutions. So we don't see them necessarily as barriers. We see them as you know, sort of those things that we need to sort of overcome and succeed in. So as much as I preface them by challenges, they're just acknowledging that they're there just to make life a little difficult at times. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Melissa. And I think your point about the changing those perceptions of the sector is a really interesting one, because I reflect on our time during the Royal Commission, and you certainly heard stories of staff sadly being afraid to wear their uniform in public if they were working in an aged care facility which wore uniforms. I know there's mixed views on that. And then you went into the COVID environment, and look, leaving aside probably a couple of notable examples where the provider wasn't seen as handling that particularly well, and the staff in the firing line of that, generally seen, I think it's fair to say, as real champions, saviours, doing amazing work in really extremely oppressive conditions when you think of wearing PPE all the time and those sorts of things. So I think there was a shift. I noticed certainly a shift in that sort of perception, and I was even pleasing this morning to see the Shadow Treasurer being interviewed on Sunrise, and when he was talking about the need to lift the wages of workers, and aged care was mentioned. So whereas, you know, it wasn't that long ago that, you know, aged care wouldn't get a look in, even in the last federal election when we actually had a little thing called a Royal Commission going on, and it didn't get a mention, which was kind of intriguing in itself. So I think that's a really good point there, and how we can change that perception around aged care is just such a critical thing that we've all got a role to play in. Peter, I might throw to you at this point.
Thanks, David. Look, I think it's been covered. The only other things I would say for me is maintaining that sense of stability right at the front line. So in the services, in the operations, with changing dynamics. So new people coming in, new people going out, new staff. We know that disrupts that harmonisation. And so that is just an operational challenge. I guess we try and tackle that by giving staff more time, and hence, you know, building up our frontline staff to give them capacity to have time, to have a gentle approach, to spend those extra minutes, you know, just supporting people transition. Staff burnout we've talked about. You know, for us though, we just negotiated a new EB agreement. And within that, we created some new provisions where, as CEO, I can provide additional days of leave for mental health support for our staff, recognising the burn, recognising the challenges. But here in Tasmania, I mean, we do get 20 personal days a year, which is different to where I've come from in different states. So in addition to that, there's also these now provisional leave that we can provide. I think under the integration model that OneCare has, and this was mentioned earlier, but the expectations of families and other residents who are living in the same environment with someone with dementia. And I guess if we think about behaviours that might be considered an expression of need, that might lead to someone being intrusive, for example. Often the family's expectations are that you can resolve it very quickly, and you should resolve it very quickly. But overlay that with security of tenure, with the time it takes to put in new strategies, I guess with the regulations, it just does take time. And I think a strategy around that is extending our education piece to families and existing residents about what they can do and what does this mean about the disease progression. And I think the more information people have, the more open perhaps they are to understanding what's going on. And I think lastly, if I can, David, it might be a little bit controversial, but hey, look, it's a reality. Sexuality in ageing, sexuality in dementia, sexuality in our aged care homes. Honestly, every day there is something that comes past my desk that I have to be aware of, respond to. And again, I think it's being sensitive to that. For whatever reason, we do find it difficult to have those honest conversations, but it is part of ageing, it is part of what we do. And I guess I'm recognising it just creates challenges because of the stigma that sits with that. And I think whilst there's lots of good information out there about that, as leaders and providers, if we can start to find solutions and just be more open and honest about that as a challenge, it just might make life a bit easier for our staff. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Peter. Did you want to give, because sexuality is such a broad area, I just wondered if it's worth giving a bit more, I'll say, colour and movement to, can you give an example of some of the issues that you're saying come up in that space for you?
Yeah, of course. I mean, obviously intimacy, sexual encounters, those types of things which are real, they do happen. And I think all of us, I can see everyone nodding on my screen. I think we're all recognising that is, but I think it's in that space. And how do you support your staff to not overlay their personal values and judgments? How do you educate the families in that space where the son or daughter might be very angry at you as a provider because you haven't protected mum or dad? And how do you then manage the Commission's responsibilities and regulations on you as a provider to create that safe environment for everyone? So it is complex and there is lots of information, but I think the reality is, look, it's that intimacy, it's touch, it's sexual intercourse, it's those things that are just part of our business, and we have to get better at managing it.
Thanks, Peter. And look, I think a really good point about that broader education piece with family and carers. And in fact, I was talking to a CEO there this week as well, and they say that was actually almost more important than the staff piece, to really make sure that everyone was on the same page and understanding of dementia, but also their approach to how they were supporting people, particularly if you're taking an approach that's an enabling one that can be perceived as, well, hang on, we're paying good money for you guys to do the care. Why is mum folding the napkins or whatever it happens to be, which is that kind of, particularly in that sort of, when you're taking that sort of more Montessori style of approach to your care. So there is an important role to actually provide that education, I think, to families and carers, so they do understand that this is actually a really positive and constructive thing that can ensure that people are living valued and meaningful lives and treated with respect as part of what they're doing in that. So yeah, I think that's a really key one. Megan.
Yeah, hi everybody. Sort of had a very varied comments, which I would agree on as well. I think for us, our biggest challenge, like everybody, is staffing. But for us, it was not to compromise on our model that we deliver to our residents living with dementia, and also to the main sites and our other sites. So we actually developed earlier on in COVID a family program. We always encourage families to participate in mum or dad's daily routine anyway, but we actually put the call out for families to see if anyone would at least show an interest to come in and help when we were actually experiencing staffing, finding staff. So we had an amazing response to that. We had over 50 families, and we developed our program. So that started. So families would come in, and it was for their loved one. So they might come and help with just some of the daily routine, maybe a shower if mum or dad was able to do that. They may then go into the central areas where they can help the staff to do the kitchens, because in our villas there's kitchenettes and there's tea and coffee and food. So they helped with that. They helped with the laundry. They helped with some cleaning as well. We developed to, the other challenge was we weren't able to get the full complement of personal carers, so we had to then again think outside the box. So we have villa assistants. We developed a role called a villa assistant, and they were educated on manual handling. They weren't to do it independently, but if they were in an area where there was only maybe one carer for 8 residents, then they would able to assist that 2-person transfer, as an example. So in our villas with 8 beds, we have average of 2 staff. So then when you have one not able to fill a shift there, 1 staff member for 8, they're very overwhelmed by that because they're used to 2. So we continue our family program right up until now. In fact, we're actually trying to push more for our other site, and our villa assistants as well. There are times where we've had to use corporate staff to go into a villa and help with the daily activities like the cleaning and the kitchenettes, but it's everybody working together. It was really important to show that we're all in it together. It's not just the personal carers or the registered nurses. We're very open and transparent with families and residents. They receive communications non-stop throughout the week about what's happening. So it was really important for us to maintain our model and not compromise on that due to the staffing issues.
I think that reflects, Megan, the really strong relationship you've got with families and carers to get that sort of response. That's really, I think, affirming. And I know, speaking to other providers that have had that really good communication with families and carers, that I think they're the ones that probably fared the best through COVID, because the families were very much understanding and appreciative of the challenges and understood what was being done and why, and also being involved in what could be the solution around some of those challenges.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say that might be one of the challenges, but one of the most things that out of that family program I was proud of, we actually had a good news story on a current affair for our family program, and a lot of good response from other families who had not really participated in the program, so that encouraged them to, and it gave the staff a really big boost to see that, yeah, they're really struggling. They're feeling like they're not being acknowledged by the government. They're expected. We've had bushfires up here. We've had to evacuate a full site. They've had the Royal Commission legislation. They've had COVID. The ongoing relentless monitoring of COVID for them. They're just, they just needed to have something really positive. So I was really excited to be able to have that on a current affair for them and to acknowledge their great work.
Yeah, what a great acknowledgement, and I think it goes to Melissa's point before about redefining and changing that perception that's out there around aged care, and sadly we don't get enough of the good news stories out there. So great that that's something that you're able to get in that sort of public domain, which is fantastic. Wow, so some really great points you've all raised there. Let me just throw to Carmel now to see what that's triggered in our audience out there, and some questions or comments that might be bubbling up for people.
Thanks, David. Well, unsurprisingly, lots of comments about workforce-related issues. Question around staff ratios, and I think Megan might have touched on that. I'm not sure whether you'd like to address that. That's a very common question, isn't it?
Is there a particular aspect to the staffing ratios that the question or questions or comments were around, or?
Yeah, well, I think it ties in with a couple of other comments, David. Questions around combining staff roles, for example, PCW or personal care assistants, personal care workers, and lifestyle staff. Question around nursing staff being overloaded and personal care assistants workload as well. So the ratio in that respect. Also, question around personal care workers not having a voice in that whole of what we refer to as a whole of team approach. And just another side comment related to workforce was around how to ensure workers doing accredited training are job ready, I think, or work ready. Seems to be a common thread.
Carmel, thanks for that. I might throw to Jason for the broader workforce piece, just because of your comments about culture and leadership, because I think they do go to some extent. I mean, you've all talked about workforce, obviously, but I might start with you, Jason, on just that whole ratio piece, and then I might throw to you, Peter, because I know you've obviously done a piece around how much hours, care hours are there. So start off with you, Jason.
Thanks, David. Look, it's a really great question, and I think everybody who's on this call today and thinking about ratios, the question I've always had with ratios is, does ratios equal quality? It was one of the things that probably gets back to culture. It's one of those questions I've never. And then you've got this idea that, you know, I spoke about this, you know, a village to raise a child. It needs to be a collective effort to do, and we speak about culture and leadership. And I think if we think about home, if aged care is a home, and it says home-like environment, it's meant to be a home. And I love what Megan said. I think it's about getting in. You know, a home is about actually doing what needs to be done. I think we, you know, leadership culture is so important, but I think we've got to be really careful as an industry about siloing it up too much. I think it needs to be very collaborative and collective. I say that, and I think the thing that we say at Southern Cross Care Queensland, we've got a program called Known and Loved. So Known and Loved is about this. So the first thing we must do is listen. If we don't listen, that's the first question we ask. So that it's got 5 pillars. It says listen. We must listen. Because if you don't listen, you typically jump into reactivity. And one thing we don't like in any home is reactivity. It's not typically great, and you don't get many good outcomes. So I think listening to all is so important. So that gets back to that culture point. I think that the next thing we talk about is make a difference. So it's, if not you, who then? You know, because I don't think it's, you know, when we silo roles up, it's like a home. You know, if you're in a partnership, you're in a marriage, or it doesn't matter where you are, there's always, you want to dig in, and this is a home. So I think we all want to make a difference. I think we have to help each other grow. I think, you know, the sense of growth, and, you know, that's a high trust environment, you know, psychologically safe, all those things are so important to culture. I said, you know, then it talks about building something, you know, and then serving something greater than themselves. So it comes back to culture. So I'm not convinced ratios is the right language. I think, you know, I know Peter well, and there's no better human being than Peter, and, you know, somebody who loves their people and serves so well. I do struggle where we think we need X amount of this. I don't know if it equals quality. That's my only question. I don't know. Do I believe that staff are overworked? Absolutely. Do I think we need to have some thinking about ratios? Yes, I think we do. But David, I don't have the answers, but I think we need to come together through a voice of listening to those who do the serving. I think would be probably most important.
Thanks, Jason. Peter.
Thanks, David. Yeah, look, Jason, I so agree with what you're saying. I mean, I wrote down as you're speaking, you know, more hours doesn't equal better care. It just means more hours or more people. You know, for me, I think you have to really tailor the more people with role clarity, and I think role fluidity. No longer should we look at roles being, I'm a carer, I'm a nurse, I'm a lifestyle person, but this fluidity of service. Coming back to our whole intent, we're here for resident care and support. and having people's ability, giving them permission and enabling them to cross outside their little bubble that we once used to like to put people into. My other comment though around ratios would be one size does not fit all, and you have to take into context the built environment. And when I say that, think about organisations that might be on multiple floors, geographically spread. That's where the one model doesn't fit. And for us in OneCare, we certainly looked at that uniquely and independently with every home and every unit. And so while some areas might have, 3 care staff on, say for a morning shift, in the other areas we've got 4 because it's geographically different and it's more challenged. I guess broadly speaking, when we think about that push for the care minutes per resident per day as part of the Royal Commission recommendation, as an aged care provider, we are forging ahead with that, and we're doing that independent of funding because we know it's the right thing to do. As I said, being a clinician right at the front end of this conversation, one of the best things about being a CEO has been able to influence the board to think very differently about care models and provisions and where you put money. Now, we're a not-for-profit organisation. We don't have stakeholders, and therefore I think there's a lot more flexibility in saying, hey, if we're truly here for our residents and we're truly here to have a good experience for our staff, then our investment piece must be back into that front end, and then that flows on to, I guess, the environment that we've spoken about as well. Thanks, David.
Wow, thanks, Peter. And I think a really important point about governance there as well, I think, in terms of making sure they're on the same page in supporting what you're trying to achieve. That fluidity, I think, is a really interesting one as we see the sector and models of care shift from that more traditional medical model I think you were referring to earlier, Melissa and others, and recognising that sort of psychosocial, broader, holistic approach does require a level of fluidity. And I know certainly providers are using the more of that household style of model of care, certainly recognising that there's almost a retraining of staff to be able to work in those sort of different models where there isn't the catering staff, you're the, you've got to be much more of all things to all people to a greater or lesser extent. So, which can be challenging for some staff, obviously. Wow, so much more of a conversation we could have in regards to that, but I'm conscious that time is our enemy at this point, and I will move on now to our final question for you all, which is that one thing that you think would make the biggest difference to the quality of care. And I know we've had a pretty broad-ranging discussion and conversation that's probably touched on a number of those things, but I will press you to if there's one thing you might want to go with, what's one thing in the short term as opposed to longer term. I'll leave that entirely in your hands. But I might start with you, Melissa, in terms of what that one thing might be.
Thanks, David. Gosh, the wish list is very long, but I think that one of the...
That's why I've said one thing.
I know, yes. Just keep me on point. Okay, I think, look, obviously there's a raft of things, but I think one of the sort of the key issues here is really ignorance, and sort of societal general ignorance around, sort of what is it that really sort of needs to change in regard to dementia care, and that is really understanding what dementia is, and the spectrums of dementia and the impact of it. And I think in a sort of a health promotion, public health sense, it's actually just having some dialogue and some opportunity to have the conversations in a public, in a community space that allow more understanding of dementia, because at the moment it's a bit pigeonholed. It's assumed that it's just one particular behaviour, and I think that's at a society level. So to allow us to sort of think about that reform and the general narrative, I just think that if there was more understanding, and then obviously, as I've said before, part of our remit is to sort of try and is to try and influence that and bring about that knowledge and actually to bubble up to the top of the conversation. And we've established a consumer advisory committee that has both residents and family members, 4 of each on it as well, and really bring into the conversation the nuance, the distinction, and really make that part of our agenda for our meetings as well. So I think it's really just the conversation and not keeping it buried, but bringing it to life. And yeah, I think that's probably it, David. I'll stop there.
Wow, and a really great point you make there, Melissa, and I know it's something that we constantly talk to government and others about, is so often dementia is seen, I'll say, through the lens of behaviour, rather than recognising that the behaviour doesn't define someone living with dementia, and more often than not, it's actually just a way of them communicating their needs. And so, but there's so much more to that, that's reflecting, obviously, the sense of which the person's engaged. Points Megan was making about having a really, welcoming, supportive built environment, staff that really are there to understand and learn and grow as part of supporting them. So I think there's so much wrapped up in that, but I think that goes back also to, I think, your earlier point about almost redefining aged care. There's a similar piece around redefining our understanding and appreciation for dementia. And look, encouraging to see, I have to say, a growing number of coverage of media in, I'll say, popular culture through a growing number of films that are made around people living with dementia, that I think are really helping, starting to redefine and shape people's thinking and greater appreciation for what it means to live with dementia and what it means to live well with dementia. So rather than thinking that, oh, that's life and now it's, sort out your affairs and that's it. No, there is so much more to living life and enjoying life, a fulfilling and rewarding life with dementia. So yeah, really important point there. Peter.
Okay, I will focus just on government commitment to the Royal Commission recommendations and funding for our staffing. For me, I think that they're just so critical to the aged care sector broadly. It doesn't matter who government is, which side of the fence you're on. I think that true commitment to recognising that a fundamental change is required and it's appropriately supported and funded to occur, would be my top point to raise.
Thanks, Peter. And look, that commitment to the reform piece, I think, is an interesting one. What are we? I never remember the numbers, but it's something like 21 different government parliamentary investigations, reviews of different aspects of aged care over the last 10 or so years. So that clearly reflects a history, sadly, of probably lack of government commitment to follow through on a lot of those things. And there was nothing surprising necessarily in what came out through the Royal Commission for any of us working in the sector. It was more that it brought it to a more of a public space. But yeah, I agree with you. And I think the challenge with that reform piece is that reform is going beyond an elected term, that it is going to take longer than a 3 or a 4 year for some of the reform that is currently underway, that certainly the Royal Commission flagged. And I think that is a challenge for our political system at a time when we're very much focused on our political system, obviously. Megan.
Yeah, I think for me, one thing for delivering the quality of dementia care and will continue to deliver quality dementia care is, I think the government, whoever it is in the particular day, needs to recognise that the funding for people living with dementia is not the same as what you do receive for people who are HHH. The amount of staffing that we have for our dementia area, for 32 residents, there's 6 PCs, a registered nurse and a lifestyle PC. For our 4 villas, we have the 6 PCs, a registered nurse, a lifestyle PC, and we have a clinical care coordinator and a diversional therapist. Now, that is a very high ratio of staff for 64 residents. but that delivers our model. I know there's quality because it comes through my complaints system. I have no complaints, high complaints. We have an open and transparent communication with the families over there. The staff do, they have very good relationships. But what really gets my bee in my bonnet and me on my little pedestal is the funding that I receive for residents who are not HHH in a dementia area, and yet I'm expected to staff that the same as I would for a resident who is very high care. I don't think the government's recognised that. It costs more money to operate a dementia area than it would on what it does on our main site. What upsets me is that these are people who are making decisions who have most probably never even had an ED program done, so they wouldn't even know. They make comments that, oh yes, my grandma was living with dementia, but have they actually been to an environment to see the models that we're delivering that is giving these residents living with dementia a quality of life and the ability to live the life that they choose, not the life that they are told that they have to live because of the funding mechanism that the government is dictating to us as providers. There, I'll get off my soapbox. I'm sorry, I get carried away.
No, that's the passion that you show for the area, which is great. I think, Megan, can I just clarify the HHH reference, because I know that might not be familiar to everyone.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's the current ACFI system. And as all of us would know, we're still up in no man land with the ANAC. So we're not all really, I mean, how are we going to budget? We're trying to figure that out, but typical of government, we'll get it at 12 o'clock midnight the day before that we're due to have it fully activated. So yeah, I'm talking about when you're talking about a resident with HHH across all 3 domains.
Yeah. And look, thank you. And I think that whole funding piece is certainly a big question mark, as you rightly point out, with the pending introduction of the ANAC. So that puts a whole lot of uncertainty out there in the organisations, but also in the marketplace for investors as well. So there's that capital piece that I think that point that was raised earlier that makes it a difficult environment for people to potentially see as a solid thing to invest in. Jason.
Thanks, David. That probably leads into my what would make the greatest difference. I think recommendation 25, the Royal Commission spoke about breaking down the silos of the services, but beyond that, the question I think we should look at is what are consumers willing to pay for, and maybe change the lens a bit away from government and maybe make it a bit more about society. So I think we need to have a look at what are consumers really willing to pay for. It's a question that we've been grappling with as an organisation, that's Southern Cross Care Queensland. It's, so at the end of the day, you've got needs in communities, and we understand needs, and we're there to serve needs. All of us, all these great people on this call today are amazing, but I think at times what would make the greatest difference is having the courage to have real conversations about are you willing to pay for, and what do you need. I just think we lack at times. I don't know if it's all for free. I think there should be, there needs to be things there. So it might be a bit controversial, this might be a bit outside the square, but I think we need to think as an industry, how do we do this together? And I know the Royal Commission spoke about probably the unfairness of things like the income tested fees and other things. There's some real opportunity, I think, for us to really reimagine. And what would make the greatest difference is to reimagine how we can actually fund this under a different lens. And I've been talking with government at all levels, especially through these reforms, to say, and I know it's not on the. It seems to disappear. I don't know why, David, but it seems to disappear. There's a sort of a willingness to think we can point the finger at government, but I think collectively, there's those who can't afford it. We understand that. We understand there's a system called Centrelink, and that we understand what that looks like. And there's those who just can't get there. But I'm really curious, and we are having conversations with our consumer groups around what are you willing to pay for? How do we do this together? So that'll be what could make the greatest difference. I don't think I'm not looking to, and it needs to be really underpinned by a philosophy of, and I think Peter started this, we spoke about transparency. I think somebody mentioned that it needs to be totally transparent. It needs to be something that we understand what this does. It's very much a social license to operate. It's something, what gives us that right and how do we do this together? And that links back to one of our strategic pillars is partnerships. And I love some of the models we spoke about earlier. If we're partnering in care, how do I contribute to that? So I'll probably leave it at that, David. But thank you for the opportunity, and it's a wonderful conversation.
Thanks, Jason. Look, I think you raise, in some ways, it's a bit of the elephant in the room with aged care, in that it is that expectation that we have in this country, just historically. I think you said the aged care system kicked off in about 1954. So, there is that expectation that I've paid my taxes, I've worked all those years. This is now where I get the return on if you call taxation and investment, maybe. And so that we haven't really had a fairly mature conversation around that, because I think, if I put my own take on that one, because I think it's a political hot potato, that politicians and political parties don't want to open that one, because the fear that the potential backlash at the polling booth in terms of how the electorate's going to view that one. And so I think it does mean that that we just haven't had that kind of conversation. So we continue to talk about how do you slice the government pie up in that respect. And we haven't gone as far as the NDIS kind of reform yet, but whether that's where that sort of ultimately leads, because it's a major challenge, obviously, with the growing ageing population, which is a positive thing in terms of us living longer and hopefully better lives, but also what that means in terms of how we fund that and ensure that we're providing the best possible care, and that people are choosing potentially to purchase items over and above that. I think what also complicates that to some extent is the level of transparency around how government funding is used currently in the aged care sector, which probably adds to that kind of complexity around, well, if you're going to charge us for things, how do we know what the government's putting in is going where it should go? So there's a number of dimensions, I think, to that could complicate the landscape on that one. Carmel, I might check in with you at this point in terms of what's been coming through the chat on this one.
Thank you, David. A couple of interesting points around the other care settings, for example, disability, people with dementia, and also in the disability setting, in-home care setting, and comment related to hospital setting. That question was particularly related to environment, so we may have addressed it earlier. So that's just one aspect. Another one, following on from the staff ratio.
Sorry, Carmel, just with the care context, was that about just what's the implications in those areas for?
Yeah, just seeking advice from the panel on, for example, in-home care, any advice that could be offered. Hospital setting, as I mentioned, around environment, so that may have been addressed, and any other comments from the panel about supporting people with dementia who also have other disabilities.
I might throw to, I can see Peter nodding, so I'm going to take that nod as potentially, would you want to offer a comment on the home care context, Pete?
Yeah, thanks, David, for sure. Look, I mean, I guess as you were talking, Carmel, I'm just hearing that question. My brain was running around. Traditionally in aged care services, we silo our business models. So we silo residential, we silo home care, and we silo independent living. And I think our hub model or precinct model that we're moving towards is not unique, and certainly it's been around for a while. But I think what that does, it starts to link all of these services together, and you can then tap into some of the resources. So if I'm in home care environment, I can tap into my residential care services, day programs, or other support systems that enable the person, you know, with dementia and their families to have a bit of respite and support, but it starts to build a pathway and a journey for care. And I think this comes back to my point around fluidity in saying, well, why can't we care for someone in the community? We bring them into our residential services, or if they're in independent living, if they go to hospital because they've had a fall, why can't we, under a new model, support them in the home to give them the supports that they need? I think, as Jason's saying, we've got to think about the whole of service in a very different way. And certainly here in Tasmania, one of my responsibilities, or things that I've taken on board myself, is to collaborate with all of the CEOs in a forum that isn't politically driven, and a forum that isn't about peak bodies, but it's a forum to say, hey, in a small state like Tasmania, how can we collaborate better? How can we learn from each other? And tearing that down, so CEOs, but think about your finance teams, your clinical governance teams, your clinical teams, being able to share stories. And we found through the pandemic there was lots of people reaching out. So, you know, a call from a CEO saying, hey, do you have a registered nurse? We're down today. And because of our size, I think we had capacity to do that. So it links back into Jason's point about thinking about it differently. But I think coming back to the point, it's, you know, I think we have to unsilo our business models and integrate them under collective model that enables a person's journey of care to be fluid, if that makes sense.
Yeah, really good point, Peter. And I might just throw to Melissa, because of that point on, I'm going to pick up your background in acute now. So whether you have a sense of that. And sorry, Megan, I saw your hand come up, and then I'll come back to you in a second.
Yeah, it's interesting actually, David. I was thinking before, and this actually speaks to the previous conversation around the role of ratios and sort of, you know, what the tasking and what has happened sort of in the acute sector is the breaking down of the activity, and we actually even see it in the specialisation, certainly, you know, sort of in the medical model as well as the nursing model as well, and just that integration of services, the vertical integration, if you like, that applies in other industries, and, you know, sort of how well that works as a business model. It's the same in that the integration of services, or the integration or the transition of the resident, you know, sort of the resident / client, the person, the fact that, you know, that the personal need of that particular individual at that point in time means that they either have to be in one place or the other, and it shouldn't be like that. But that is effectively very reflective of what happens in the acute sector. You know, there's very much this is what I do, and when I'm done with you, you go over here, and this is what they do with you. So I think that's a fantastic, you know, sort of point to make around the fluidity and around the transition and the integration of services based on, as we started with, the individuals, the personal needs of that individual, not defined by the particular program of works on offer. So I think there is a risk here. We need to stay very much away from what has happened or what's transpired in the acute sector, and really work on, you know, sort of maintaining that integration or the fluidity of services, as you say, Peter.
Thanks, Melissa. And I'll throw to you, Megan, for a very, very quick comment, because I know we're pretty much out of time.
Yep, I'll be very quick. So because we provide residential aged care services, and there are many providers on the Sunshine Coast that do all of the home care packages very well, and retirement, we about 5 years ago created our Dementia Living Cafe. So within our community, our residents, our potential residents who are living out in their home and getting home care packages but feel isolated from information, they attend our cafe, and it's monthly, and they're the ones that own it. They direct it, they decide who attends, they decide what education purposes they want. We have a board, and they created a booklet that we've distributed to within the community. It's a tool that they know how to access services, because a lot of people whose partners feel very isolated because all of a sudden their husband has dementia and their friends don't wish to still socialise with them. So they felt like they didn't know where to turn. So that's part of our integration into residential aged care, by still delivering that service to our community.
That's fantastic, Megan, and what a great resource. Look, that brings us close to time. Wow, I'm not even going to attempt to summarise that brilliant discussion and conversation. I will reflect on, though, the certainly the the creativity and being open to innovation. But overarching throughout our conversation, I just want to acknowledge the amazing passion you all show for this incredibly important work that we're all involved in on a day-to-day basis. And thank you for sharing your thoughts, reflections, insights today. Hopefully, if there's any politicians listening, they might consider some of that in their upcoming platforms. But I'd ask all of our participants online if you can give us a virtual clapping of hands in the classic deaf way, and thank you so much for your time and being part of today's panel. And thank you, secondly, then, to our participants online. Some really great questions coming through there, and you also contributed to this being a really valuable discussion. And certainly the recording of today will be available after today's proceedings, so you will get access to that. A few other things just in closing. First and foremost, I do want to thank the amazing team that Taylor Fleming has headed up to really make today a success. I think from our end, no major technological or other glitches. Hopefully from your end as participants, you didn't experience too much either. So certainly it didn't happen by accident. There's a lot of planning that went in behind. So I do want to thank the team for all their efforts in that. You should be receiving an email inviting you to complete a feedback survey on today. Really encourage you to complete that, and that will help inform the future webinars we are planning as part of this and other series. There will also be certificates for CPD points that will be issued, I understand, within about 7 days. So don't sweat on it if that doesn't come in the next 24 hours. They're on their way, as they say. Also want to mention that at the next webinar that we have planned, a Lunch on Learn, is on enabling independence, the case for allied health in dementia care, which will be held on Thursday, the 19th of May from 12 to 12:45. So a slightly shorter one for you. I think you'll all agree that that whole area of allied health in aged care is a much undersung, underdeveloped and much needed one in terms of improving aged care, but also dementia care. The link to that should be going up in the chat for you, but we certainly know that rehab and enablement is obviously an important piece for everyone, but certainly people living with dementia. But allied health is not a routine part of dementia care. So we will have a panel of experts again, like we've had today, talking about some of the benefits that can flow from that and some of the models that are out there where people are actually using that. So a slightly different focus to that one, but encouraging if you are interested in certainly registering for that one as well. So with that, I close today's proceedings. Thank you again. Thank panel members and participants, and stay safe, and thank you.